Joining me now is Democratic Senator Chris Coons, who serves on the Foreign Relations and Judiciary Committees. And there are key votes today on, of course, that big defense authorization bill. Senator, first of all, this latest incident does raise questions, concerning questions about his health. I don't know if you've been in meetings with him recently, but we understand that he also had another fall after his fall and his concussion and his recovery, another fall at the airport not too long ago. And it clearly was a concerning incident yesterday.
Andrea, I was just in a meeting with Prime Minister Meloni of Italy, where Senate Republican leader McConnell and our majority leader, Senator Schumer, led the meeting. Senator McConnell was engaged, was focused, asked good questions. I spoke with him on the floor last night after the incident that you just replayed, and he seemed engaged and agile. It is important that he and President Biden have a decades-long relationship. As you saw in the clip you just showed, President Biden called to just check on him, express his concerns, and Senator McConnell had a witty response. He is a seasoned political warrior, but also someone who enjoys a relationship with President Biden, born of decades of fighting here in the trenches together of the Senate. And that, frankly, helped contribute to a number of the bipartisan wins that President Biden and the Congress had over the last 2 years. There are other senior Republican senators who also have long relationships with President Biden. Part of what President Biden ran on in 2020 was that, unlike his predecessor, he understands this place. He has relationships here. He would be able to deliver on sustained bipartisan solutions to the problems facing average Americans. And the last 2 years bore that out. Things like the infrastructure law, the CHIPS and Science law. And frankly, the last point I'll make, Andrea, Senator McConnell has been rock solid in supporting our efforts to sustain Ukraine as they fight against the Russian occupiers and invaders. Senator Schumer and Senator McConnell both have sustained broad bipartisan support here in the U.S. Senate. And the Prime Minister of Italy is also a leader in NATO, a leader in providing resources and support to the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian military. So we had a constructive conversation with her today about Italy's role as a close U.S. NATO ally, and Senator McConnell fully participated in that conversation.
Well, that's all very good news indeed, because as we know, and as you experience all the time up there, those relationships are critical. We know famously that Senator McConnell and Harry Reid, for instance, did not have a good working relationship, and that did stalemate a lot of things on the Hill. And after January 6th, he certainly didn't have a good relationship with Donald Trump, even though he was singularly responsible for spearheading those Supreme Court nominees through that are, you know, so controversial, but so much in Donald Trump's, court in terms of what he's been bragging about as he runs for re-election. Well, let's move on to the war in Ukraine, because his support is so important. As there are people in both parties, in House and Senate, who are beginning to bail a little bit on that as the time progresses. We're beginning to see some improvement in the counteroffensive in the last couple of days, last 24, 48 hours maybe, but it's going to be a long haul. And now there's a new report from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And that report just today, an unclassified version of what you've probably already seen in more detail, is that, yes, China is leaning forward and doing more to help Russia in Ukraine, not crossing that red line, I'm told, yet, of military aid, but dual-use aid, and that government-supported companies are supporting different kinds of technology.
And that's right, Andrea. The PRC is staying on the sidelines for now in terms of providing critical military equipment and financial support to Russia. But they are purchasing huge amounts of Russian oil and gas. They are providing dual-use equipment. So, for example, selling helmets and body armor that clearly has no civilian use, but is not an offensive weapon. I think this is another example of how President Biden and his administration has led on Ukraine. They proactively released intelligence that showed that Xi Jinping and the PRC were on the verge of coming into this conflict in Ukraine by supporting Russia with offensive weapons. After that was released and after an exchange of views between the United States, our administration, and Xi Jinping, they backed off of that and have so far not done it. But that would be a game changer. We should look back to the history of the war in the Korean Peninsula, where U.S. troops, UN provided and supported troops, and the South Koreans had all but won the war on the Korean Peninsula when China decided to come into that conflict on the side of North Korea. And it changed the balance, and it prolonged the war for years. If the People's Republic of China came in to this conflict on the side of Russia, it would be a very negative development. And I think our country and many others have been effectively communicating to Xi Jinping that his so-called friendship without limits with Vladimir Putin is only hurting China's prospects on the world stage. Right now, as Russia is using hunger as a weapon of war, as Russia is striking with missiles and other attacks, grain silos and storage facilities on the Black Sea coast of Ukraine, there are dozens of countries in Southwest Asia, in Africa, in North Africa that are facing famine as a result of Russia's immoral use of hunger as a weapon of war. For China to side with that conduct on the world stage would be a tragic mistake, both for the increasingly hungry peoples of dozens of countries that rely on Ukrainian grain and oil exports, food oil exports, but also for China's reputation in the developing world. So it's my hope, given this report today, that China's leadership, Xi Jinping, will reconsider their support for Putin's aggression in Ukraine and for Putin's use of hunger as a weapon of war.
And we're hearing that Putin is planning another trip to Beijing, actually, coming up. It'll be their first meeting since the spring meeting by Xi in Moscow. Also hearing reports that Prigozhin has shown up at that Africa summit in St. Petersburg, and that would indicate that whatever deal they did do, he and Putin, he still will be active in the African continent, where he's been raking in billions from having his mercenaries there guarding those leaders and reaping the benefits from their diamonds, their gold, their other minerals. I want to move on, though, to Donald Trump and Hunter Biden, actually. Your reaction as a family friend, as a Delaware senator, as a longtime, intimate of the Bidens, to this. It's more than a hiccup. The deal fell apart, and it has to be put back together again if he's going to figure out a way not to face a trial.
Well, Andrea, you asked me to comment on both Donald Trump and Hunter Biden, and I'll speak briefly to their respective legal challenges. The press is reporting that Donald Trump, former President Trump's lawyers, have been notified by Jack Smith that he may well be indicted in the coming day or two for his alleged role in the January 6th insurrection. And Hunter Biden, as you just referenced, had a hearing in front of a district court judge in Delaware about a plea deal. The judge expressed some real concerns about the supervision of a piece of that agreement that would have allowed Hunter to avoid any prosecution for a gun-related offense. This is a common practice in prosecutions where you're a first-time offender, the offense is related to drug abuse, and you enter into a supervision agreement where, as long as you do not reoffend in terms of anything involving owning weapons or substance abuse, that that record is expunged. This was not unusual. But in this particular case, the judge was asking about who is going to supervise that. That piece of it fell apart. I expect that they'll be back in front of the judge with a revised deal in a matter of weeks. Here's what matters, Andrea. In one case, it is the former president who is trying to be the presidential nominee for the Republican Party who is facing very real legal challenges. In the other case, it's a private citizen, yes, the president's son, but someone who never served in the White House, who had no official role. I think that is a significant difference. None of this that relates to Hunter Biden and his history of substance abuse and his plea deal and the District Court of Delaware relates to President Biden. all of the charges that have already been laid against former President Trump in other contexts and that may soon be further advanced by an indictment directly relates to the conduct of former President Trump, in this case, in office. Conduct that resulted in an armed gang assaulting the building that I am in here in the United States Capitol. So let's just be clear. One is about the conduct of a former president in office, and the other is about a private citizen, the son of the current president. There's a stark difference.
No, you are absolutely correct, and I should not have analogized those two things together in my haste. There's no question that they are of very, very different proportions. There's no comparison. What I meant to be asking you in my defense is, are you concerned about the House Republicans trying to make much of this now and saying that there is something to be investigated that could warrant opening an impeachment inquiry of the sitting president of the United States based on the fact that there is an ongoing investigation into his son's business dealings and the allegation that he was involved, which they have strongly denied and there's no evidence of?
That's right, Andrea. My understanding from press accounts is that the Department of Justice intends to make available U.S. Attorney Weiss from Delaware, a Trump-appointed U.S. attorney, to speak directly to the allegations that are being thrown around by the House majority, the House Republican majority, so that the U.S. attorney can answer questions and be clear that he had 5 years, he had all the resources he needed, that the choices that were made about venue and about charges were his choices, and that he stands behind the plea agreement that was advanced before a federal district court judge. If he says all those things, and according to press accounts, that's what he would testify to, I think that ends the repeated efforts, the lines of inquiry that House Republicans are raising. It is my hope that we can all move forward past this chapter and that Hunter Biden can move forward with his recovery and his life, and that this 5-year federal investigation into broad and wild allegations of his conduct will be brought to a close.
And returning to former President Trump, it's clear that this case, from what we know about what is being investigated, is far more serious than anything else that he has encountered, even the documents case, which is very serious, because it does involve an insurrection, an attempt to overturn the election, many states, fake electors, alleged attempt to seize voting machines. What does that tell you as the special counsel is going to take this on as soon as today, as the stakes for the former president and the stakes for the nation's confidence in the political process and the judiciary?
Andrea, the rule of law is foundational to our democracy, the concept that no one is above the law. And we in the Senate did, in fact, conduct an impeachment trial of the former president for his role on January 6th. And he was nearly convicted. It came a few votes short. And those Republican senators who voted not to convict, but who spoke about it at the time, a number of them commented that it seemed to them unnecessary to convict the former president because he was a former president and unlikely to run or serve as president again. Frankly, President Trump's conduct on January 6th, what he did or didn't do to incite the mob and to encourage them to come and attack the Capitol and to seek to overturn the peaceful transfer of power following an election, that conduct is foundational to both our system of ordered liberty, our Constitution, and our understanding of his willingness to respect those guardrails, those rules, and those traditions. The United States has had a peaceful transition of power over and over and over for literally hundreds of years. This was the closest we came to that not succeeding, and I think President Trump, former President Trump, should be held accountable for that. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Senator Coons. Thanks for being with us. We appreciate it.